Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this session on Zero Trust and the importance of securing data. My name is Osman Khan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for ITS Squared, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session today. So the session flow will be, I'll initially give a brief overview of where we've come from. We'll talk about perimeter security and how the perimeter has changed and evolved with the dynamic changes of today. And then we'll talk about the definition of zero trust architecture, followed by the how zero trust has evolved from the Jericho Forum all the way to where we are today. And then finally, we'll get to the crux of the session, by which I'll introduce the esteemed panel guests, who are subject matter experts, who will answer some of our pertinent questions in terms of how we realize zero trust and what some of the challenges are and how we address them. So without further ado, let's talk about how we got here. Perimeter security. They say now that the perimeter is dead. So how did we get here? So traditionally, most enterprises would have considered their internal network as trusted, right? And therefore they would build the equivalent of high walls, effectively, your castle walls, that are protected by external perimeter defenses, such as firewalls and IPSs and the like. Again, based on the premise that the external network is untrusted, i.e. the internet, the internal network is trusted. And for any services that need to be exposed to the internet, such as your corporate website, your mail servers, they would be hosted within demilitarized zones, within DMZs. And also, as the primary threats were considered to be within the untrusted zone, i.e. the internet, therefore most of the monitoring was conducted inbound, right? So you're concerned about the threats that are coming inside from the internet, as opposed to potentially the insider threat. So what we found is effectively that, it's called different things, but effectively with this castle mentality, where you've got these high walls protecting your inner sanctum, you effectively have what, like a hard shell. Another analogy is like of an egg, right? You have a hard shell, but a soft yolk, or a bonbon, right? Where they say you again, a hard shell and chewy on the inside. The problem with that is, so again, once you've penetrated the initial wall, the castle wall, your perimeter defenses, that boundary wall, then it's free for all, right? Effectively, the defenses within the castle, within your enterprise, where your crown jewels traditionally have been, are then vulnerable to further attacks that aren't detected, right? Because typically the detection controls and security controls in the traditional architecture have been at the boundary. So once a given asset has been compromised by way of the cyber kill chain, where you basically phish a certain user, or you encourage them to click on a specific URL that, basically means that a malicious payload is deployed on a given laptop, for example. And we all know that the insider threat now accounts for about 30% of all potential breaches. So once that external threat, in combination or maybe with the internal threat, but the external threat via the cyber kill chain has compromised that given asset, and then effectively then phones home outbound to the internet, to a command and control server. Now that outbound traffic typically isn't focused on. Traditionally, we would look at inbound traffic because that's where the perceived threats were. But once a given asset is being compromised, that outbound traffic, which could be exfiltration of data through DNS tunneling or through HTTPS, which being encrypted, would not get detected. So one of the things that we need to start to look at doing is monitoring outbound traffic. If the outbound traffic is significantly more than the inbound traffic, which is against the norm, then that's cause for concern. Or if the outbound traffic, for example, is accessing websites or domain names that are relatively new or dynamically changing, or are not from the top 1 million websites that people typically access, and there's organizations like Alexa and Cisco umbrella that publish these lists, then that would be cause for concern, because ultimately the threats are to our data assets, and if we don't secure them in a more dynamic fashion with more context, then we're basically kidding ourselves in terms of putting up this perimeter wall. Yeah, like I said, according to the Verizon Breach Investigations Report in 2020, they basically said that up to a third of the insider threats are due to, up to a third of the breaches are due to insider threats. So they're the challenges with the traditional model. So data, they say, is the new perimeter. So basically, where your data is where you need your micro perimeters to be deployed. We live in a world today now where, you know, the assets, your data assets, are no longer within a confined area within your data center. They're on SaaS, you know, on cloud platforms, whether it's SaaS, IaaS, or PaaS. You've got OT connectivity to IT, right, represented by this plant and manufacturing logo here. You've got the Internet of Things, IoT devices that are proliferating across your estate. 5G obviously is coming. And then you've got obviously the corporate laptops are now accessing these various data assets through VPN or without VPN, right? So the point is, the concept now is that data is now deployed on a number of platforms, be it on the cloud, within your given data centers, on corporate laptops, and is available to end users, your users, and sometimes in many cases your partners and your vendors through different means, and that could be through mobile tablets, bring your own device, your corporate issued devices. So these are some of the challenges that the traditional perimeter-based model can't effectively address, and therefore we need a new paradigm. We need an approach whereby which we should consider the internal network, your insider network, and the external network, both as untrusted. And we'll speak a bit more about that shortly. So the zero trust definition, one of the challenges that we've got is most of the vendors out there who like to sell their point solutions have their own definition of what zero trust is. It's almost become a marketing term. It was initially coined by friends at Forrester, one of their consultants there, John, there basically defined zero trust in 2010. And here's the definition itself. Now, the key aspects of the definition to bear in mind is that zero trust is not a point solution, right? It's an architecture, it's a framework. Obviously it needs to be underpinned by solutions, but you need to look at it holistically, right, from a people, process, technology perspective. The key aspects of the definition that I want you to take notice of is, one is that it abolishes the idea of a trusted inside network, you know, that idea of your data being within a defined area such as the data center, and that your internal network is therefore trusted. That notion needs to go and is dead, right? So it's no longer, your data is no longer just confined in a given corporate perimeter, because as we said, the data now is extensively deployed across different platforms and different mediums. The other aspect of the definition to bear in mind is that zero trust mandates that you create micro perimeters of control around your sensitive data assets. So wherever your data is, that's where your security controls need to be deployed. And we'll talk about some of those controls that you can deploy shortly. Now, some of the key aspects of zero trust architecture and zero trust networks is that, like I said earlier, is that the network is always assumed to be hostile. So whether you're on your internal network or you're on the internet, it doesn't matter. They're equally considered as hostile. And you should, you know, it's traditionally people would say it's not a case of if you're going to be breached, it's a case of when you will be breached. But now, you know, now we actually live in a day and age whereby which you have to assume you've been breached. It's not even a case of, you know, when you will be breached. You have to assume that you are already breached and you have hostile threat actors within your network, and therefore you don't trust the network, right? The network is no longer to be considered trusted. You assume breach, and therefore when you communicate within even the internal network or when you're an external network, you should encrypt all traffic, right? So that's one of the key aspects of zero trust networks and the zero trust architecture. And again, like I said, the external internal threats exist on the network at all times. And if anything, we should consider you're already breached. So you should consider you're already breached. And second thing is you should consider both the internal and external networks as equally threatening from a threat actor perspective. Network locality is no longer sufficient for deciding trust on a network. I mean, what this means is traditionally, if you're on your internal network, that IP address space would be considered trusted, and therefore firewalls would permit access based on traditional files would provide access from your given source IP address. Oh, you're from the internal network, therefore this source IP address is trusted, open up access to the given assets. That no longer is something that we can live with, again, because the network locality we're saying is irrespective of where you're coming from, we're going to assume it's already hostile, it's already breached. The other aspect of traditional security, like I said, is that it would traditionally look at your IP addresses or just your IP addresses, and potentially then you look at your identity. The idea of the zero trust architecture is that every device and every user network flow is authenticated and authorized. So it's not like there's an implicit access that's permitted based on your identity and or your locality, as in your network IP address. But now it's taking it a more holistic perspective. So we look at contextual authentication, including things like what type of device are you trying to access the given service? What is it, a corporate issue device, or is it bring your own device? Where are you coming from a geolocation perspective? Are you trying to access resources at 2 a.m.? So look at behavioral aspects as well. Are you trying to access resources at 2 a.m. where typically you would only access a given resource, a workload, during normal business hours? So the concept of a trust engine and a trust score, or effectively the riskiness associated with a given user trying to access a given resource or application within the organization or within the cloud or wherever that may be, each and every transaction is assessed against the riskiness associated with that user identity, the device, whether the device has a certificate, for example, that basically by way of mutual TLS will authenticate both the device and the workload. So it's a two-way street. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is that we're moving away from just authentication based on IP address and identity, and looking at far more holistic view of, like I said, your device that you're accessing from, whether it's authenticated via a certificate, the user identity. Now we're looking at passwordless solutions around that. So biometrics and the like, facial recognition, fingerprint authentication, the geolocation of the given user that's trying to access the given service. Are they trying to access a resource that they should typically be permitted to access? All of these would basically be holistically looked at for each and every given access request to the given application or workload that the given user is trying to access. So the idea is that you're taking a far more dynamic, holistic, contextual approach to authentication and authorization, and this is done on a session by session basis, and as opposed to, if you come from this specific IP address and either this identity, we just give you access all the time. So it's contextualized based on your behavior, your device, the user, other risk factors, and based on that, the policy engine within the zero trust architecture will then authenticate you and authorize you and give you access to the given resource. So in order to achieve this, because obviously overhead, from a management perspective, would be a nightmare if you had to do this manually. So one of the key aspects of zero trust architecture is to achieve this from a automation perspective, right? So, and this is why having a trust engine and a policy engine and defining that such that the enforcement can be done by the data plane is crucial. The other point that's important to sum this slide up, and the points here, is that traditionally, as Ronald Reagan said, we would trust but verify, right? We're moving that paradigm to verify then trust. So implicitly, there is no trust. until you've been verified and authorized, like I said, based on those various attributes that we spoke about. And then once you've been verified, you're given access for that finite period of time, and it's not something that's indefinite, so it's contextualized. So zero trust and its evolution, it's not a new concept. So a bunch of CISOs got together in 2004, and part of the Jericho Forum, they established what they call the 11 commandments. They tried to get to 10, but they couldn't quite do that. What you'll notice though, if it's only a one and a half pages, I believe, long. I mean, if you review those commandments, most of them are relevant today. So this is not something that's revolutionary or something that's new. I mean, it's 16 plus years old. Unfortunately, we haven't evolved with the times from a security perspective, and many organizations still today are taking the perimeter, the hard perimeter approach at the borders of their enterprises. So that obviously needs to change, because we know it's not working, as we mentioned earlier, especially due to the insider threat and the fact that the data is propagated across many platforms, including the cloud and the like. So early 2004, network access control architectures start to get deployed. You have Cisco, ISIS of this world, and Forescout, different technology vendors out there that provide these technologies. Basically, the idea being that you don't get authenticated onto the network if you don't have the right, for example, the given correct MAC address that's been coded in, or you don't have the right policy, for example, that you don't have the latest build on your laptop, you don't have the latest patches, you don't have the latest antivirus definitions deployed. So unless you have a combination of things, you wouldn't typically get access to your internal network. Then in 2010, Forrester, like I said, they coined the term of zero trust, and this paradigm shift was codified further. In 2014, Microsoft, advocated the concept of assume breach. Assume basically that your internal network has already been compromised, and therefore you need to take a different approach to how you secure your enterprise. In 2014, Google published Beyond Corporation, the idea that, again, they adopted a number of the principles from zero trust for architecture that was specified by Forrester, and they deployed it. So in essence, what they did was they deployed their own internal PKI infrastructure. They deployed certificates on all the devices. It only catered for their own corporate issued devices, to not bring your own device. It may have changed now. And basically, they set up a reverse proxy for their services, and with single sign-on. So now, obviously, we're not all Google, and we can't. They have almost an unlimited budget. So they say they significantly exceeded their initial budget, but it certainly still paid dividends from a return on investment perspective. And so there are a number of white papers out there that they've published that you can read, but it took several years for them to deploy their equivalent of a zero trust architecture. In 2017, Zero Trust Networks was written. This book was written by Barth and Evan. It's a fascinating read. It talks about some of the concepts that I already discussed briefly. And again, they focus on this concept of having a trust score, and they also talk about the control plane and the data plane. So it's being software defined, whereby which the brains of your policy engine and your trust engine sit in the control plane, and the data plane, such as where the enforcement takes place and where performance is key. That's where your proxies and your firewalls and the IPSs and the like sit. So they talk about how this can be architecturally deployed, but they don't talk about technologies, obviously, and they themselves feel that they haven't, the industry hasn't evolved to the point where it makes it easy to deploy a zero trust architecture. So they still feel at that time in 2017 it was somewhat lacking. And now you obviously, from a Microsoft perspective and other vendors, you've got Microsoft Hello, you've got facial recognition and biometric authentication. We live in the world of passwordless authentication, or at least we should be shifting towards that. And now we're looking at, from a network perspective, again, we're looking at micro-segmentation, software-defined perimeter, and the like. Micro-segmentation effectively, where you've got, miniature firewalls, a firewalling capability across all your various services and applications and workloads. And software-defined perimeter basically is the idea being that you don't access the given service until you're authenticated and using mutual TLS via the control plane, then you're provided access. So basically, as a given user, you wouldn't even have any direct access with a given service until you've been authenticated by a proxy that authorizes you to give you, authenticates you and authorizes you, and then it provides you a token to provide you access to the given workload. So that's a brief overview of the evolution of zero trust architecture. And now we'd like to get into the discussion with our panelists. So I'll just briefly introduce our panelists. We have Daniel Wright, who is the Regional Sales Manager for StealthBits. We have Rajiv Raghunarayan, who's the SVP for Products and Marketing at Cyber Inc. Ashraf Kohel, who's the Regional Sales Director for the Middle East at Group IB. And we've got Vishal Gupta, who's the founder and CEO of Secure. And we've got Mohammed Al-Muzannan, who's a Senior Systems Engineer for MIA at Infoblox. So without further ado, I will stop sharing so that we can commence, so you can see our panelists if you... Right, welcome gents. So we'll now get into the Q&A, the crux of the meeting, right? So the exciting part of the meeting, as I would say. So first and foremost, thank you very much for your time. One of the key challenges that we've got, Vishal, as you're aware, is that it's all well and good talking about zero trust architecture and you know the various deployment methods, but how would you go about implementing a successful zero trust architecture program? How do you approach that? What are the key elements around that? And what are the pitfalls that we should look to avoid?
Okay, thanks, Osman. Great session. Good summary of 14 years of work in 10 minutes is always a tough act to do. But I think the first thing before we start out on a zero trust program is for data security is to make sure that we make some resolutions to ourselves. Right? So the first thing is to acknowledge that this is about data. Right? The focus is data security, and the reason to protect a network or an application or a device is not so much that we care about these infrastructure elements as we care about the data that resides on the device or travels over that network and so on. Right? And no amount of threat protection can replace data protection. I think that's a very important acknowledgement that you can protect your devices and your networks and your applications no end, and it still may not further the goal of data protection in any meaningful way, right? So I think the distinction between preventing or protecting infrastructure and protecting data has to be very clear, because a lot of enterprises tend to confuse between the two. Right? Because the devices and networks and applications that handle our data today are not in most cases even controlled by the enterprise. Devices are external, networks are external, applications are external, and therefore the fundamental tenets on which security relies on have all broken down. Right? So I think that's a very important acknowledgement to make. The second thing here to acknowledge is that data protection is not for the enterprise. It is for the extended value chain around the enterprise, because data is going to partners and customers and vendors and so on. And therefore, just protecting whatever is within the enterprise is necessary, but not sufficient. Right? I think a successful data protection initiative would in my opinion consist of 3 phases, and they're not sequential, meaning all 3 of them are happening in a cyclical manner, and I would qualify them as protect, track, and identify. So the first thing is to protect what you already know, what an enterprise already knows is confidential, right? It has personal information, it has intellectual property, it has forward-looking financial statements, and so on. The second thing is to be able to make sure that these assets, these data assets, are trackable. So it's not about chasing your data as it goes to different devices and applications and so on, but protecting your data and making it trackable. And the third in that sequence is to be able to constantly identify new elements that need to be protected, new pieces of data that need to be protected, which can create risk for the enterprise. Right? Pitfalls, I think, are to try and boil the ocean. Right? That's the most common challenge that I have seen enterprises face, which is to try and do big programs across tens or hundreds of thousands of users and all data elements across the whole enterprise without focusing on what the enterprise already knows is highly confidential, which can be, devastating if these kind of data breaches happen and so on, right? And the second thing, the second pitfall for in this context is to make sure that there is a clear choice between best of breed solutions and a one size fits all kind of solution approach, right? Because these two can mean very different things for enterprises, right? So I would say if I were to look for two, biggest pitfalls when implementing this program is to make sure the enterprise starts small and to make a clear choice between is it like a one size fits all or the enterprise wants to bring together the best of breed technologies in each of the respective spaces. Yeah, thanks a lot, Osman.
Thank you very much, Vishal. That was enlightening to say the least. So great. Rajiv, so tell us about what this means for the users and productivity, because like I said, security normally is seen as something that is hampers productivity and something that's not embraced.
And that's actually a great question, because I would say any technology that you adopt, any solution that you adopt, any architecture that you adopt, there's a planning element to that particular architecture. There's an approach to that particular solution. Let's take Zero Trust as an example, and I think we were talking about data protection all this while. But how is that actually delivered? If you actually look at data, it basically, where do you access data from? Who accesses data? What kind of access do you have? And how is the access granted through the network? Those kind of become the facets in which the data protection comes into play. So if I think of a user and user accessing data, what kind of policies do I put into place for a particular user? Determine what kind of access they have. Let's just take a simple example. The user is going to a particular website. Should all users have access to all websites, to all services? When I think of external and internal, I think those policies, those decisions that businesses make matter. So any zero trust technology that you adopt, and the first phase actually goes into planning, and I think Vishal made that point earlier, is don't try to boil the ocean, right? The idea is, what are you trying to protect? Where's your biggest risk coming from? Is it the end user and where their risk is coming, or the risk that they add, therefore obviously invest in that particular area? Is it the services that they're looking to access, and of course invest in that area? And even as you invest, I think there are two questions that you still need to answer. What access do the users need to have, and what type of security controls would I put into place? Let me take a couple of examples here. ZTNA is a very well-known architectural element of zero trust. Network access is a very well-known architectural element of zero trust. If I'm doing ZTNA, one of my key questions to answer is the mapping of which user, which application, who needs access to what application. A lot of organizations walk in and say, I'll do ZTNA without that planning. Basically, it's a recipe for disaster, because that particular planning will actually tell you what that mapping needs to be. And if you have unmanaged devices and you use a endpoint-based zero trust network access ZTNA solution, how is that going to work for unmanaged devices, right? So when you got to ask these questions, answer these questions beforehand. Similarly, take the other extreme. I have users who want to access the internet. I can have policy-based controls. But the second thing that I need to do is how they access the internet. Should I allow them to access any site? Or should I allow them to access sites through some layer, some level of defense, let's say a remote browser isolation like technology, where they can actually manage the access and remove the risk away from that particular endpoint? User productivity can be retained, in fact, can be enhanced with zero trust, I would actually say. but with the right amount of planning that you put in place.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rashid. Appreciate that. So, Ashraf, question for you. Data, right? I mean, lots of organizations with the proliferation of data and data basically exploding exponentially, many organizations don't know where their data is, right? But one of the questions that they may not have even considered, has the data already been exposed? Is it already out there in the wild, right? So how would you even know if your data is out there in the wild, in the dark web, for example, being exposed? It's already exposed and being sold, for example, or used in other malicious manners. How would you know that? And how would you use threat modeling to establish a baseline for zero trust architecture?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Osman, for the question. So there is a trend basically today, which is discussed a lot as a concept, which is basically the moving or transition. How do we connect both the compliance-led security and the intelligence-led security? And in simple terms, we think of them as a bottom-up approach, which is we already have a current infrastructure in an organization, could be an enterprise or a bank, that we are looking at optimizing, trying to get the best return on investment, and answering the ultimate question. Remember, we are all about one thing. We are all about the CISO's question gets answered by the CEO, are we secure? Right? It's a one sentence that carries a lot of pain in the transition of today's world. And the angle of working on threat or intelligence-led security is basically, we start from both. We say we are working as an organization today on our existing infrastructure, but let's look at the threat landscape. And the threat landscape could mean, what are the company profile on this particular organization profile? Is it a bank or what we call a CNI and a critical national infrastructure? Or could be even a mid-sized company, but it holds a lot of intellectual property or digital rights like music and movie production and so forth. And from that particular point where we start looking at a threat profile of the organization, then from there we define what we call the new data perimeter, because the traditional data, which could be on servers, could be on people's laptops, or on with all the beauty and pain that came with bring your own device. An end user today could have something as simple as a bot on their own mobile user, which is they use it both for the enterprise and for their own personal use, could compromise a network. So the idea here is that we look at the full threat intelligence profile. So we also get attacker intelligence. We understand who could be attacking you today. Are they available, or is there any specific vulnerabilities, not only at the network level, but also at some of the employees, some of the executives. We have seen companies being attacked only on social media by fake pages, fake profile for employees and executives, and so forth. So the idea here is when you look at the threat intelligence, the two stories should complement each other. You should be looking at a threat intelligence on your own profile, your own organization, and also looking at your existing compliance and existing infrastructure as well. And the two stories need to connect. What we can do there is probably 2 or 3 things that need to happen. I think the very first thing is we need to decouple the architecture discussion from the technology discussion. We need to look at, there is a business, basically a business model where we look at the threat intelligence and the security profile and so forth. That's rather than just trying to connect dots from existing technologies into where we want to go. The second piece, I think, from my perspective, is a wider audience in the organization. I've seen a lot of CEOs carrying that burden by themselves, and I think there should be a much wider audience in the organization. They need to involve CMOs and CSOs, because the pain affects the sales, the brand, the marketing, and other organizations as well, rather than one person carrying the burden. Especially in today's trends with COVID-19, there is enormous numbers of people today working remotely and working online. And the third piece, I would say, back to Vishal's point, is you need to establish a baseline today. Do not boil the ocean, but you need to know where you are today. Always the the framework is always a journey. It's not something that you would do, you will flick a switch and it will happen. You need to establish a baseline into where are you today, either through a service or through a compromise assessment or penetration testing. Get that embedded into your organization culture, because the picture, as soon as anything moves, a firewall configuration moves, anything change, data gets moved from point A to point B, a new application get deployed on company laptops or whatever. As soon as something moves, there is a vulnerability somewhere. And if there is a vulnerability, it will be exploited. So get into the organization's culture. That's the third and last point I'll close with. You need to always establish a baseline, do a fire drill, always know where you are. If I've seen a lot of organizations, they invest a lot in infrastructure, and maybe they spend sometimes 6 months to a year without doing a compromise assessment or a penetration testing or understanding or establishing even a baseline. Let's forget the acronyms for a second. So I think these are the 3 key points that I think that threat intelligence or intelligence-led security can bring to the enterprise. Thank you.
And if I may add over there that historically it has not been possible, but now with present day technologies, it is actually possible to embed trackability into data itself. And so you can actually get to know if your data has been breached, right? Encryption, rights management kind of technologies actually have this SCADA kind of systems where data will transmit its location back to a central console constantly.
Okay, thank you, Ashraf and Vishal, for that. So, Dan, a question for you. Like we discussed earlier, lots of organizations have the challenge of understanding, where their sensitive data is, the value associated with it, how they go about securing it. So, what approach should they take to understand where their data is, what its sensitivity is, and how should they go about trying to secure it?
Yeah, thanks, Osman. That's a good question. I think we've heard already boil the ocean and the journey. I think this is the key message there regarding enterprises is that this is a journey. It's going to take some time. We've discussed on the call already, some of the components and the all the considerations that need to be taken on board, when we go into a zero trust program, which can take a long period of time, but we have to start somewhere, right? So I think, first of all, to gain an understanding of where our data is, who has access to it, what's the classification of that data, and as you've rightly said, Osman, where does our sensitive data reside? This is the data that can presents an attack surface, for the malicious activity. The challenge that businesses have today is that their data resides in multiple silos, whether that's on structured data, unstructured data, in the cloud, mobile devices, as we've already discussed. And there's many types of sensitive data, and that can be pertinent to the particular vertical sector that a business is working in. I mean, typically, the standard stuff, if you like, bank account numbers, credit card numbers, but also usernames, passwords, personal, PII data, addresses, phone numbers, health records, if we're in talking to organizations in the health sector, all this data needs to be protected. And if it's exposed, we all know what the consequences are. It can be very damaging for a company from a monetary perspective, but also brand reputation as well. So we're looking at it from that angle, from and also regulation and compliance as well, which we know, is having to be implemented and has been for the past few years. So that's, all the considerations that we need to address. When we talk to businesses, or I talk to businesses, when they're embarking on such a program or a project, it's sometimes quite daunting. And I think what businesses should keep in mind is that not only this is a task that needs to be done, but at the same time we're enabling the business to be more agile, more in control of what they're doing as a business to make them successful. So while do the discovery stage, let's say, and address, some of the topics that I've said already, we're also, getting a good understanding of our infrastructure and, gaining control and visibility on that. And there's also some, key other, let's say, use cases, for argument's sake, that, we will address along the way, and that's just in the discovery stage. Cost savings on stale data, for example. We'll see data that hasn't been accessed for 10 years or 7 years, whatever it may be, sat on expensive storage, as an example, that the business no longer needs. And then all the security aspects as well, removing users that have over provisioned access. We know that users, when they're moving through organizations now, they're acquiring access that, is just not governed. We're reducing the attack surface as well, and potentially reducing costs as well, management costs, licensing costs, all those types of use cases along the way. So yeah, I think, going back to the start, it's definitely a journey, definitely a lot of considerations, but you have to start somewhere.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, very insightful. Absolutely. So common theme there in terms of not boiling the data, right? That's certainly. Yeah, so Mohammed, I just let me put this as a backdrop for the next question. We've talked about the zero trust architecture, zero trust networks. You've got this whole ecosystem. How do you go about realizing this, Mohammed?
Okay, thanks for this question. First of all, I just need to complement and align with what other colleagues and even you mentioned, that the zero trust architecture, this is something like a response to a digital transformation and the challenge that inherited from these initiatives, where the user started to become everywhere. There is now we are living in the borderless age of the network and the access, even with the new technologies that help to respond to this digital transformation, like adopting a new technology for SD-WAN. We know, for example, enterprises used to connect their branches through their backbone, MPLS, and this kind of things. So the old architecture, definitely it's not something that compelling for the new challenge, which is definitely driven by the business as a priority, and then with the technical or the technology for the network and the security, which we always try to help to answer for the prospect, for the market, and for the partner. So taking the zero trust as zero trust access as an architecture, definitely, as mentioned by others, it has to start with two things. First is with the business, to sit with the business, with the executive, the CEO, and know what is the priorities when it comes to reducing the risk, increasing the revenue, protecting the intellectual property, and this kind of things. Second is we need to set up priorities for where exactly that risk happened, and from there we can kick off the security program and then implement the security capabilities. I'll give you, for example, we are not reinventing the wheel. When it comes to zero access capabilities, we have definitely the data is in the core of the zero trust program, okay? And we will have all the capabilities, which is actually, we have it running and implementing everywhere, okay? We have something need to protect the network. You need to look at the network with different capabilities, like embracing the next-gen firewall, the DDoS, and secure web gateways, secure mail gateways, and all these capabilities. Plus, when it comes even for the workloads, or let's say the data center, you need to make sure that you are protecting the data, that it can be in your private network, it can be in your public network. So you need to make sure that you comply with the compliance. You want to make sure you have that visibility, implement micro-segmentation even on the workload. Not only that, when it comes to users and when it comes to, for example, even the devices, definitely we need to have kind of management for the endpoint, management, implementing an endpoint defenses. So this is actually the same holistic approach, which actually we used to do since decades, okay? But what differs is the priorities. Because to be honest with you, from my field experience, we usually see the prospect or the market start with doing the conventional security like endpoint gateways and this kind of things, then doing the data classification or the data DLP capabilities as the last milestone. But when it comes to zero trust, okay, actually, in my opinion and my perspective, we have to start by shifting this mindset and starting with the data itself, okay? Last thing, just I need to give an example. For example, for what we call a foundation security services. For example, DNS. DNS is used, it's the backbone of the LAN, it's the backbone of the enterprise, it's the backbone of the internet, and what we can even say it's the backbone of the digital transformation. DNS is used by the internet protocol and it's used everywhere, okay? Unfortunately, the DNS as a control point wasn't considered by the enterprises in their security program, okay? And this is actually making the industry lacking, you know, the integration, the visibility, okay? If we can bring that DNS and the other essential network services like DNS, DHCP, and IP address management with an integration capability and even leverage the other data and threat intelligence and data classification and bringing that all the complete ecosystem, okay, together, okay. Sorry. Hello?
Yeah, no problem. Carry on.
So if we can bring that DNA, that conventional or core network services and bringing to the ecosystem of the zero trust, which actually embrace the automation, the orchestration, and the analytical, okay, we can get a central visibility, and even we can deliver a more orchestration and automation around the complete ecosystem, which definitely will lead for more efficient risk reduction and better ROI. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That's great. We're winding up in terms of time. I mean, it was very important contribution for each and every one of you. So what we'll just do now is we'll just finish up with final thoughts from each of you, right? So if you can just summarize very quickly any final thoughts that you've got with respect to zero trust architecture and how we can realize that. We'll start with you, Vishal.
I think the slide that you had earlier is very appropriate, and I would guide everybody back to that slide, Osman, and start from the bottom up, right? It is about protecting the data and just set up the base and work your way to the top. Right? That would be the one thought for my advice to all the enterprises out there.
Thank you, Vishal. Rajiv?
My simple thing would be, again, data is absolutely crucial. Understand, however, zero trust is about reducing that attack surface, is about the assumption that you're likely to be breached. So how will you respond? How will you reduce the attack surface, especially when you're considering the biggest shortage that we have is for security professionals? So zero trust can actually help you with actually solving both those problems, and understand that, and there's several tools and technologies that can help with that.
Thank you, Rajiv. Ashraf?
Thank you. I would just summarize again in 3 points probably. I think the most important thing is zero trust is a problem that should be shared across the organization. It definitely should not be the IT organization pain point only, because of what we discussed earlier. The second piece is always know where we are today. Test, make sure that we can establish a baseline today. And I think the third piece is around just threat intelligence and social media. Just understand your threat profile. That's the top 3 things. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you, Ashraf. Dan?
Yeah, I think my last thoughts really are all enterprises are being asked to do more with less these days, right? And that's only going to get worse, I should imagine, particularly with what we're going through now. So just, take a step back, look at the whole program overall. Don't get anxious, because I actually, know that people do get anxious about these these projects and programs as such, and just liaise with the vendors, because, you know, there are some very good technologies out there, integrated technologies, and they may find that given time and the right consultation that, you know, this is achievable.
Thanks very much, Dan. And last but not least, Mohammed.
Okay, yeah, I think the gents, they elaborate in all the points. Just from my side, definitely Zero Trust, it's a program, it's a final state, it's the final, the end of the journey, and it's a mindset, okay? Data is the core of, and the core of the journey, and definitely you need to get and start with what is important for the business, okay? Plus bringing all the essential security and capabilities around these priorities, and from there embrace the hybrid architecture, okay, and bring that integration and automation and intelligence to bring more better operational model and reduce the risk, which ends up by having a better return of investment for your enterprise.
Thank you very much. Well, that's been great, gentlemen. Very valuable insights from all of you, and hopefully you wanted to benefit. I'm sure they have significantly in establishing where they are today and where they need to get to and how they can realize their journey of Zero Trust. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Osman. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.